When you look back at the 20th century, there's a clear dividing line before World War II and after it. Before the war, the world still had innocence left, a belief that peace treaties and politics could keep chaos in check. After it, that illusion was dead. Everything changed in 1939 when Adolf Hitler decided that words and borders didn't mean much anymore. On September 1st, German panzers crossed into Poland, and within days the world was set ablaze. But what most people don't realize is that the opening act of this global firestorm wasn't about tanks or even soldiers. It was about shock. The Germans unleashed a new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was fast, brutal, and efficient. Planes screamed overhead, bombing communication lines, railways, and troop formations. Tanks rolled in before defenders could even regroup. Infantry followed, sweeping through towns that hadn't even realized a war had started. The old ways of fighting, slow trench battles, static lines, gentlemen's wars were gone. Europe was witnessing industrialized destruction at its finest and worst. Within weeks, Poland was erased from the map, and Britain and France, still haunted by the ghosts of World War I, declared war, hoping they could contain the madness. But containment was a fantasy. The phony war, as they called it, was a brief calm before the storm. For months, Allied troops sat behind the Maginot Line, waiting for an attack that never came. Until it did, but not where they expected. In May 1940, Germany launched its assault westward through Belgium and the Ardennes, a move the Allies thought impossible. But the impossible was Hitler's favorite trick. In a matter of weeks, France, one of the world's proudest military powers, collapsed. Paris fell, and the world gasped. The swastika flew over the Eiffel Tower, and Hitler, standing there in a photo that would haunt history, looked like a man convinced that destiny itself had chosen him. Britain stood alone. Every other democracy had fallen or surrendered. Even the United States, still nursing its wounds from the Great Depression, wasn't ready to step into another European mess.
But across the English Channel, the last bastion of freedom in Europe was preparing for the fight of its life. Then came the Battle of Britain, one of the most defining air battles in human history. The Germans believed if they could crush the Royal Air Force, they could invade England. They had the numbers, the planes, and the confidence. But what they didn't have was the grit of a cornered island nation. British pilots, many barely out of their teens, flew day and night, sometimes 5 or 6 missions a day, chasing Messerschmitts through the smoke-filled skies. London burned under the Blitz, entire neighborhoods leveled, families huddled in underground stations as bombs whistled down. But through that horror, something unbreakable was born. Churchill's words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," weren't just political poetry. They were the truth. Britain didn't just survive, it proved that Hitler's war machine could be stopped. For the first time, the unstoppable had been stalled, and it sent shockwaves across the world. But Hitler wasn't about to stop there. With Europe under his boot, he turned his eyes toward the rest of the world. His ally, Mussolini, was struggling in North Africa, and the deserts of Libya and Egypt soon became the next great battlefield. This wasn't like Europe. There were no forests or cities to hide in, just endless sand and heat that could melt steel. Out there, under the blazing sun, a new legend was born. Rommel, the desert fox. He was clever, fast, and unpredictable. His tank tactics were like desert storms, appearing out of nowhere, striking hard, and vanishing before you could react. The British forces fought fiercely, but struggled to adapt.
They'd win one day, lose the next, and every gain felt temporary. When America finally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the desert became a proving ground for U.S. troops. Green, untested, and full of energy, they were about to learn the brutal lessons of real war. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Hitler's arrogance was reaching new heights. In June 1941, he broke his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and an ambition so huge it bordered on madness. At first, it worked. The German army swept across the Soviet plains like a wildfire, capturing city after city. Soviet soldiers were surrounded, entire armies wiped out. But as the weeks dragged on, one thing the Nazis hadn't planned for began to turn against them: Russia itself. The weather, the terrain, and the sheer size of the Soviet Union were like enemies no bullet could kill. As winter closed in, the same soldiers who had marched through Paris now froze to death outside Moscow. The tide of war was shifting, but no one knew it yet. The world was in chaos, Britain still reeling, Russia bleeding, America still licking its wounds from Pearl Harbor. But what was coming next would change everything. The United States stepping into the fight for real, and the battles that followed would decide the fate of humanity itself. From the burning skies over Britain to the frozen steppes of Russia, from the deserts of North Africa to the beaches yet to be stormed, the Second World War was far from over. The next chapter would see new heroes rise, old empires fall, and a new kind of warfare unfold, one that would define the world for generations. The deserts of North Africa were like another planet, a vast, shimmering battlefield where men and machines were swallowed by sand and heat instead of mud and snow. It was here that the war found a new rhythm, one of speed, cunning, and endurance.
The British had been holding the line, battered and bruised, but when Hitler sent Rommel to bail out his Italian allies, the whole game changed. Rommel wasn't just another general. He was a strategist born from chaos, a man who could smell opportunity in the middle of disaster. His German Afrika Korps hit like thunderbolts, striking deep behind enemy lines, outflanking, encircling, and vanishing before the British could regroup. His men idolized him, his enemies respected him, even feared him. They called him the Desert Fox, and for a time the title fit perfectly. The desert became his hunting ground. The British fought hard at places like Tobruk and Gazala, but Rommel always seemed one step ahead, his panzers cutting through the sand like sharks in water. But there was a problem even the cunning Desert Fox couldn't outmaneuver: supply lines. The more he advanced, the longer his lifeline to Europe stretched, and the Royal Navy made sure fuel and ammo were never enough. Every German tank that ran out of gas in that desert was a monument to overreach. Then came El Alamein, the battle that turned the tide. It was October 22, 1942, and the British, under General Bernard Montgomery, had rebuilt, regrouped, and rearmed. This time, they weren't just defending, they were coming for blood. Rommel's men dug in, waiting under a sky that glowed orange from artillery fire. But Montgomery had numbers, supplies, and air superiority. When the attack came, it came like a hammer. The desert shook with the roar of engines and guns. Waves of British tanks surged forward. The Germans fought tooth and nail, but the momentum was gone. Even Rommel, exhausted and ill, could feel it. The Afrika Korps began to fall back, and for the first time, the invincible Desert Fox was being hunted. Churchill later said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." Those words weren't just rhetoric. They marked the moment when the Allies finally found their stride. And right as Rommel was retreating west, something else happened. America entered the fight for real. It wasn't just aircraft and supplies anymore. It was boots on the ground. In November 1942, under Operation Torch, U.S. and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria. It was the first major American ground campaign of the war. For many young American soldiers, this was their baptism by fire. They were green, brave, and sometimes a little too confident. At Kasserine Pass, they got their first harsh lesson from veterans of the German army. Rommel's panzers tore through inexperienced U.S. lines, scattering units that had never seen real combat. It was a shock, fast, brutal, humiliating. But what separated the Americans from everyone else was how quickly they learned. Within weeks, they reorganized, adapted, and came back swinging. Generals like George S. Patton took command, and with his fiery temper, strict discipline, and ruthless drive, he turned raw troops into an army that could take on the best.
By mid-1943, Rommel was out of North Africa, the Axis forces trapped and defeated in Tunisia. For the first time in the war, the Allies had pushed back hard and won. The victory in Africa opened the door to the next phase, the invasion of Italy, Hitler's so-called soft underbelly of Europe. But calling Italy soft was a cruel joke.
What awaited the Allies there was some of the fiercest, bloodiest mountain fighting of the entire war. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 was the first step. American and British forces stormed the beaches under a hail of machine gun fire. It was chaos, dust, fire, and confusion. But within weeks, Sicily fell. The operation forced Mussolini out of power, and Italy's fascist dream came crashing down. But Hitler wasn't letting go of his southern flank that easily. He poured troops into Italy, turning it into a fortress of stone and steel. The mountains became killing grounds. Monte Cassino, Anzio, Salerno, names that still echo with blood and sacrifice. Through it all, the war had changed shape. What began as a blitz of domination was now a global struggle for survival. The Allies were learning to fight together. Americans, Brits, Canadians, Free French, Poles, all under one banner. Their factories roared night and day, building tanks, planes, and ships faster than Germany could destroy them. And while Rommel and the Axis reeled from defeat in Africa, a new front was about to explode on the other side of the world. The vast Pacific Ocean, where America's fight against Japan was turning into another monster entirely. But before that, one more critical storm was brewing, back in the heart of Europe. The Germans still held the continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Volga River, and the Soviets were preparing to deliver a counterblow that would shake the entire Eastern Front. The next great turning point wouldn't be fought in the sands or the seas. It would be fought in a place that became a symbol of both suffering and endurance, Stalingrad. And when that city fell, or refused to fall, it would mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's grand empire. If there was one place on earth where hell opened its gates during World War II, it was the Eastern Front. Nothing, absolutely nothing in history compared to the scale of blood, destruction, and human suffering unleashed between Germany and the Soviet Union. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, he believed it would be over in a few months. His generals promised him a quick victory. Moscow before winter, the Soviet Union broken, communism wiped off the map. But what Hitler didn't understand was that he wasn't just fighting an army. He was fighting an idea, a willpower forged in ice and iron. The German war machine tore through the Western USSR with terrifying speed. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and annihilated in places like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev.
Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched into captivity, many never to return. The Red Army was reeling, disorganized and bleeding, yet somehow it refused to die. Factories were dismantled and moved east, rebuilt in Siberia under freezing winds, and within months tanks and rifles were rolling off the lines again. The Soviets had lost men, cities, and territory, but they hadn't lost their soul. Then came Stalingrad, the battle that changed everything. On paper, it was just another city, industrial, gray, sitting on the Volga River. But in Hitler's mind, it was symbolic. It carried Stalin's name, and taking it would be a psychological death blow to the Soviets. In the summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus marched east, pushing deep into southern Russia. The advance was fast and devastating, and soon the German columns reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. But what they found there wasn't just another target. It was a nightmare waiting to happen. The Soviets, under General Vasily Chuikov, decided that not 1 inch of that city would fall without blood.
The fighting that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Streets changed hands dozens of times. Buildings became fortresses. A single factory could be fought over for weeks. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev turned the ruins into hunting grounds. German soldiers called it the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, because they were fighting from basement to basement, sewer to sewer. As autumn turned to winter, the nightmare deepened. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Food ran out. Ammunition was scarce. The Germans still believed victory was within reach, until the Soviets struck back. In November 1942, under Operation Uranus, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, not against the city itself, but around it, encircling the entire German Sixth Army in one of the most brilliant moves of the war. Within days, 300,000 Axis troops were trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler ordered them to stand and fight, promising air supply and reinforcements that never came. Paulus begged to retreat. Hitler said no. So they stayed, starving, freezing, dying in a city of ghosts. By January 1943, Stalingrad was a graveyard. The once mighty German Sixth Army was reduced to skeletons wrapped in rags. On February 2nd, Paulus surrendered, something Hitler considered unforgivable. Over 90,000 German soldiers marched into captivity, and only a handful ever made it home. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been not just stopped, but shattered. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point for the entire war. It broke the myth of German invincibility and proved that the tide could turn, even against impossible odds. But the Soviets weren't done. The next summer, in 1943,
the Germans tried to strike back with one last massive offensive at Kursk, a city that became the site of the largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks and nearly 2 million men clashed across the rolling fields of Russia. For weeks, it was a mechanical apocalypse. Tigers, Panthers, and T-34s colliding head-on in fields that burned black with oil and fire. The German plan was bold but predictable, and this time the Soviets were ready. They had dug in with layers of defenses, minefields, anti-tank guns, artillery, and reserves waiting behind every hill.
When the German assault hit, it slammed into steel and courage. The Luftwaffe couldn't gain air superiority. The panzers couldn't break through. By July's end, the German offensive had failed completely. The Red Army counterattacked, pushing westward. And from that moment on, the Germans would never again go on the offensive in the east. The hunter had become the hunted. After Kursk, the Soviet war machine began its relentless march west. City after city, Kharkov, Kiev, Minsk, fell back into Soviet hands. Every victory came at a cost measured in lives, but Stalin's army was now unstoppable. The Germans were retreating, their lines collapsing, morale fading. What had begun as Hitler's dream of conquest had turned into his slow nightmare of defeat. As the Red Army closed in on Eastern Europe, the Western Allies were preparing for their own great offensive, the liberation of France. The plan was to strike hard, strike fast, and open the long-awaited Second Front that Stalin had been demanding for years. But before the world saw D-Day, before the beaches of Normandy became legend, the war in the East had already decided one thing: the Nazi Empire was doomed. The Eastern Front had eaten up millions of lives, soldiers, civilians, entire towns erased. The numbers were staggering. Over 25 million Soviet dead, cities turned to rubble. But in the end, it was the Red Army that carried the war from its darkest hour to its moment of vengeance. And as 1944 dawned, the thunder from the east was moving closer and closer to Berlin. Hitler's days were numbered, but the world didn't know it yet. Because before that final reckoning, before the Reich crumbled into ashes, the Allies had one more massive gamble to make, one that would change history forever. The world's eyes turned west across the English Channel to a day codenamed simply Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy was coming, and it would decide the fate of Europe.
By the spring of 1944, the world was holding its breath. The Allies had fought across deserts, mountains, and oceans, but one final wall still stood between them and victory: the continent of Europe itself, locked under the Nazi iron fist.
Hitler's armies had dug in from Norway to the Pyrenees, with the Atlantic Wall, a vast chain of bunkers, gun emplacements, and beach defenses stretching for miles along the coast. Every inch of it screamed, "Come and get us." But the Allies were ready to do just that. For months, the greatest military operation in history had been in the making. They called it Operation Overlord. The plan? Land on the beaches of Normandy, punch a hole in Hitler's fortress, and drive straight into the heart of France. It sounded insane, storming a heavily fortified coastline under enemy fire. But it was the only way to win the war. And so began the most daring gamble of the 20th century. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, under a gray, cold dawn, the largest armada ever assembled moved across the English Channel. Over 5,000 ships, carrying nearly 160,000 men, crept through the mist. The sound of waves was broken only by the distant thunder of artillery. Above them, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already dropping behind enemy lines, landing in dark fields and swamps, scattering like ghosts in the night. Some landed right on target, others miles away, but every one of them had one mission: disrupt, destroy, and confuse the enemy before the main invasion hit. Then came H hour. The beaches had names that would be burned into history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. As the ramps of the landing craft dropped, hell broke loose. At Omaha Beach, where American troops faced the toughest defenses, it was chaos. Machine guns ripped through the surf. Artillery shells exploded in the shallows, and men were cut down before they even hit the sand. The tide ran red. Radios failed. Units were shattered. Yet, through sheer will and courage, small groups of soldiers, many of them barely out of high school, crawled forward, inch by inch, using dead bodies and tank traps for cover.
Engineers cleared paths through barbed wire under fire. Medics dragged the wounded to safety. And slowly, unbelievably, the tide began to turn. By noon, Omaha was still a slaughterhouse, but it was a foothold. The men who survived that beach were heroes before the day was even half over. At Utah Beach, the landings went smoother, mostly because the Americans accidentally landed in the wrong spot, but luck was on their side. British and Canadian troops fought fiercely on the eastern beaches, linking up and pushing inland. By nightfall, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore in France. D-Day had succeeded. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. But Normandy wasn't over when the beaches were taken. In fact, that was just the beginning.
The countryside of northern France, the bocage, as they called it, was a nightmare for attackers. Narrow lanes, thick hedgerows, and hidden machine gun nests turned every advance into a bloodbath. The Germans fought back viciously, using every advantage the terrain offered. The Allies had the numbers, the air power, and the momentum, but the Germans had desperation, and desperation makes men fight like cornered wolves. Battles like Caen and St-No dragged on for weeks, entire towns flattened by bombers. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Infantry fought yard by yard. Yet every day the Allies crept forward, pushing deeper into occupied France. Then came Operation Cobra, the breakout. In late July, after weeks of grinding warfare, American bombers unleashed a firestorm that tore open the German lines.
Through that breach charged General Patton's Third Army, fast, fearless, relentless. Patton's tanks rolled like thunder through the French countryside, cutting off German retreat routes, liberating town after town. Civilians cheered from rooftops, waving flags that had been hidden for years. The occupation was cracking. And for the first time in 4 long years, hope returned to France. By August 1944, the Allies were racing toward Paris. But the City of Light was still under German control, and Hitler had given a chilling order: if Paris is to fall, let it fall in ruins. Bridges were wired for demolition, landmarks mined. But fate had other plans. Inside the city, the French resistance rose up, seizing police stations, building barricades, and taking back their streets. When the Allied tanks finally rolled in on August 25th, led by General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, the city erupted in tears and gunfire. Crowds filled the Champs-Élysées, kissing soldiers, waving tricolors, singing the Marseillaise. Paris was free again. The war wasn't over, but for one glorious moment it felt like victory was within reach. Yet, even as the bells of Notre Dame rang out in celebration, the fight was far from done. The German army, though broken, was not beaten. Hitler had one last card to play, a desperate counterattack that would test the Allies like never before. In the frozen forests of Belgium, winter was coming, and with it, the Battle of the Bulge, the final great stand of Nazi Germany. Before the world could breathe again, before the guns would finally fall silent, one more storm had to rage. Winter came early in 1944, and with it came Hitler's last desperate gamble. His empire was crumbling, Soviets closing in from the east, Allies pushing hard from the west, but he wasn't ready to give up. In December, under a heavy blanket of snow, the Germans launched a surprise counterattack through the dense forests of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Caught off guard, American troops were hit hard.
The Ardennes forest exploded with tank fire, artillery, and chaos. The German plan was to punch a hole in the Allied lines, split the front in two, and capture the vital port of Antwerp, hoping to force a peace on their terms. For a few days, it almost worked. The German spearheads surged forward, creating a huge bulge in the Allied front line. Towns like Bastogne became names burned into legend. Surrounded, freezing, and low on ammo, the 101st Airborne Division held the line with sheer guts. When the Germans demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave one of the most iconic replies in military history. Just one word: nuts. Reinforcements came fast. The skies cleared, and Allied planes roared overhead once again. General Patton, driving his Third Army north through the snow, did the impossible, turning his entire force 90 degrees in a matter of days to relieve the siege. His tanks smashed into the German flank, breaking the offensive apart. By January 1945, the Bulge had been flattened, and Hitler's last stand in the West was over. The German army had spent its final strength, and now all that was left was retreat, ruin, and reckoning. The Allies crossed the Rhine River, stormed through the industrial heart of Germany, and liberated concentration camps that revealed the true horror behind the Nazi regime. The world saw what had been hidden behind barbed wire and propaganda. Millions of innocents murdered, a crime beyond words. Rage, sorrow, disbelief. Every soldier who walked into those camps carried those ghosts home forever. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Red Army was closing in fast, rolling through Poland, crushing the last of the Wehrmacht. Town by town, mile by mile, they clawed their way toward Berlin. By April 1945, the German capital was surrounded.
Inside the city, Hitler hid in his bunker, raving about betrayal and lost glory, while Soviet artillery thundered outside. The once great Reich was now nothing but rubble and despair. Streets filled with civilians running for shelter, soldiers fighting to the last bullet, children drafted into hopeless defense. The Soviets pushed block by block, their banners closing in on the Reichstag. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life, ending the nightmare he had unleashed on the world. A week later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Across Europe, bells rang, crowds filled the streets, and the war in Europe was finally over. After 6 years of global chaos, 60 million dead, and an entire world scarred beyond imagination, silence. But that silence wasn't peace. It was the beginning of something new. The United States emerged as a superpower. The Soviet Union, too. The Cold War was on the horizon. Europe would rebuild, but the lessons of World War II would never fade. They were written in the ruins of Berlin, the beaches of Normandy, and the ashes of cities that once stood proud. The men and women who lived through it, who fought, sacrificed, and endured became the greatest generation. Not because they wanted war, but because they faced it and never gave up. World War II wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of ideas, of tyranny against freedom, of darkness against light. And in the end, the world learned a brutal truth. Freedom isn't free. It's paid for in courage, in blood, and in the unyielding will to stand when standing seems impossible. And that, my friends, is how the greatest war in human history was fought and finally won. From the burning skies over Britain to the frozen streets of Berlin, from the sands of North Africa to the beaches of Normandy, every battle, every life, every sacrifice led to the freedom we have today. If you felt the weight of those moments, if you could see those soldiers standing in the cold, fighting not just for themselves, but for the future of all of us, then hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to the channel for more real, untold war stories that shaped our world. This is your storyteller signing off, reminding you that history isn't just something that happened, it's something we must remember. Because only by remembering can we honor the ones who lived it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.